Is this slop even edible? The voice was sharp, laced with an arrogance that cut through the low hum of the mess hall. It belonged to a young petty officer, his uniform crisp, his face set in a petulant scowl. He tapped a plastic fork against his tray, a rhythmic, irritating clink of plastic on plastic. Seriously, old man, are you just going to stare at the peas, or are you going to put them on my plate? Some of us have work to do. Tony Maxwell, his back stooped slightly by age but not by spirit, did not flinch. His hands, gnarled and weathered by time, held the serving spoon with a steadiness that belied his 80-plus years. He moved with a deliberate economy. A man who had learned long ago that wasted motion was a luxury he could not afford. His eyes, a pale but clear blue, lifted from the steam tray and met the petty officer's impatient gaze. He offered no retort, no defense. He simply scooped a measure of green peas and deposited them onto the tray, the gesture as precise and unhurried as all the ones that had come before it. The petty officer sighed dramatically, a theatrical display of frustration for the growing line behind him. "Thank you," he sneered, the words dripping with sarcasm. He pushed his tray along the line. It's a wonder this base can function with civilians shuffling around like they're in a retirement home. The confrontation, a small but ugly spark of disrespect, hung in the air. The other sailors and Marines in the line shifted uncomfortably. Some stared at their boots. Others pretended to be engrossed in their phones. It was easier to look away, to pretend not to hear the casual cruelty. To intervene was to invite trouble, to draw the attention of someone who clearly felt entitled to his bad temper. Tony continued his work, his expression unchanging. He scooped carrots for the next person, then mashed potatoes, his movements fluid and practiced. He had heard words like these before. They were like water off a duck's back, insignificant and fleeting. He was here to do a job, to serve these young men and women. Their opinions of him were their own business. The petty officer, however, was not finished. He had stopped at the end of the line, waiting for his companions, and his voice carried back. "Look at him. Probably got a cushy job here after shuffling papers in a supply depot for 20 years. Bet he thinks that makes him some kind of hero." He laughed, a short barking sound devoid of genuine humor. His friend, a seaman who looked barely out of his teens, mumbled something inaudible, clearly uncomfortable. But the petty officer was on a roll, his ego inflated by the captive audience. A supervising officer, a lieutenant with a clipboard and an air of harried importance, noticed the bottleneck. He strode over, his polished shoes clicking on the linoleum floor. "What's the holdup here, petty officer?" he asked, his tone already accusatory. The petty officer saw his chance. "It's this server, sir," he said, pointing a thumb back at Tony. "He's slow, for one thing, and he's got a bad attitude. I made a simple comment, and he's been giving me dirty looks ever since." It was a lie, a casual twisting of reality to suit his narrative, but it was effective. The lieutenant's eyes narrowed as he looked at Tony, seeing not a man but a problem, a disruption in the orderly flow of his mess hall. "Is this true?" the lieutenant demanded, turning to Tony. His voice was loud, unnecessarily so, as if he were addressing a subordinate who needed to be disciplined. Tony placed the serving spoon down carefully on a clean cloth. "I am just serving the food, sir," he said, his voice quiet but clear. It held no trace of anger or fear. It was the voice of a man stating a simple fact. "That's not what I heard," the lieutenant snapped. "I have service members to feed, and you're holding up my line and giving people attitude. What's your name?" "Tony Maxwell," he answered. "Well, Tony Maxwell, your attitude is not welcome here. This is a military installation. We expect a certain standard of professionalism, even from our civilian contractors." The lieutenant was puffing up his chest, performing his role as the man in charge for the benefit of the watching crowd. The petty officer smirked, vindicated. He had successfully manufactured a conflict and was now watching someone else fight his battle. It was a petty, ugly display of power, and it was aimed at a man who showed no inclination to fight back. The injustice of it was a thick, sour taste in the back of everyone's throat, but still no one spoke up. The line remained silent, a long, shuffling chain of complicity. The lieutenant leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "Maybe this job is a little too fast-paced for you. Maybe it's time to hang up the apron." The petty officer, emboldened by the lieutenant's support, walked back towards Tony, a swagger in his step. He pointed at the old man's forearm, where the sleeve of his blue uniform was rolled up. A faded tattoo was partially visible, an intricate design of wings and a skull, blurred by the passage of decades. "What's that supposed to be, old man?" he sneered, his voice loud enough for the whole line to hear. "Some biker gang you were in back in the day? The Hell's Grandpas? As the petty officer's mocking words echoed in the large room, the world seemed to momentarily fracture for Tony. The clatter of trays, the hum of the ventilation, the face of the sneering young man, it all receded, replaced by a different sound, a different feeling. It was the rhythmic, deafening whump 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 of helicopter blades beating against thick, humid air. He wasn't in a mess hall in Southern California. He was in a Huey, the door open to a world of suffocating green. He could feel the sting of sweat and dust in his eyes, the familiar weight of his rifle in his hands. He looked down at his own arm, not as it was now, wrinkled and spotted with age, but as it was then, young, sinewy, and tanned by a relentless sun. The tattoo was there, fresh and dark against his skin, a stark symbol of the promise he and his brothers had made to one another. It was a promise sealed not in a tattoo parlor but in the crucible of a jungle whose name was whispered in history books, a place where ghosts were made. The image was gone in a heartbeat, a fleeting echo of a lifetime ago, but the memory it carried, the weight of it, remained. A few tables away, a chief petty officer sat with his lunch, his back to the serving line. He hadn't been paying attention to the low-grade drama, but the sneering mention of the tattoo had snagged his ear. He had heard enough. He was a man who had spent 30 years in the Navy, a man who understood its culture not just from regulations but from its very bones. He knew that true strength was quiet, that the most dangerous men were often the least conspicuous. He also knew the look of certain tattoos, the ones that weren't picked from a wall but were earned in places that didn't appear on any official map. He slowly turned and looked at the old man behind the counter, truly looked at him for the first time. He saw the stoic calm, the steady hands and the faded ink on his forearm. A cold knot of dread and urgency formed in the pit of his stomach. He had a sickening feeling that the lieutenant and the young petty officer were making a mistake of historic proportions. The lieutenant, meanwhile, was pressing his advantage. "I'm going to have to ask you to come with me to the office, Mr. Maxwell," he said, gesturing with his clipboard. "We need to have a discussion about your future employment here." The chief petty officer stood up. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with an authority that had been forged over decades of command and responsibility. He didn't intervene directly. He knew that a confrontation on the floor would only escalate things and further humiliate the old man. Instead, he walked calmly towards the exit, pulling his phone from his pocket. He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over a name that few on this base had the clearance to call. He pressed the button. The phone rang twice before it was answered by a crisp professional voice. "Admiral Miller's office. Ensign Davis speaking." "Ensign, this is Chief Petty Officer Graham," he said, his voice low and urgent. "I need you to get a message to the Admiral. It's an emergency." There was a pause on the other end. An emergency was a word that carried significant weight. "What is the nature of the emergency, Chief?" "You need to tell her to come to Mess Hall 3, right now. There's a civilian server here, an old man. His name is Tony Maxwell." The chief took a breath. "Tell her it's about his tattoo, the one on his forearm. Tell her it looks like the ghost of the Delta. She'll know what it means. Tell her she needs to get here now." Inside the quiet, climate-controlled efficiency of the base headquarters, Admiral Miller was conducting a high-level briefing on fleet readiness. Maps and charts glowed on a large screen as she listened intently to a captain presenting deployment logistics. She was a woman who had reached the pinnacle of her profession through a combination of sharp intellect, unwavering resolve, and a deep, almost instinctual understanding of naval strategy. Her focus was absolute. Suddenly, the door to the conference room opened softly. Her aide, Ensign Davis, stood in the doorway, his face pale, his posture rigid with an urgency that bordered on alarm. He knew the protocols. Interrupting the Admiral during a flag-level briefing was an act reserved for only the most dire of circumstances. Every officer in the room turned to stare at him. The captain faltered mid-sentence. Admiral Miller turned her head, her eyes fixing on the young ensign. She didn't speak. She simply raised an eyebrow, a silent command for him to justify this unprecedented intrusion. "Admiral," the ensign began, his voice barely a whisper. "I apologize for the interruption. I just received a call from Chief Petty Officer Graham. He insisted it was an emergency." The Admiral's expression remained unchanged, a mask of stern patience. "And, he's in Mess Hall 3, ma'am. He said you needed to come immediately. There's a situation with a civilian server." The ensign swallowed hard, clearly aware of how flimsy this sounded. "His name is Tony Maxwell. The chief said to tell you. He said to tell you it's about his tattoo. He called it the ghost of the Delta." The name and the phrase landed in the sterile room with the force of a physical blow. The air seemed to crystallize. Admiral Miller froze. The pen she had been holding slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the polished mahogany table, the sound unnaturally loud in the sudden complete silence. Her face, a moment before a study in command focus, transformed. The stern mask dissolved, replaced by a look of stunned, profound disbelief. Her eyes, which had been scanning logistical charts, now seemed to be looking through the walls, into a distant past. The other officers in the room exchanged confused, worried glances. They had never seen the Admiral look like this. It was as if she had seen a ghost. "Repeat that," she commanded, her voice low and tight. "Tony Maxwell, ma'am," the ensign said, his voice trembling slightly. "And the ghost of the Delta." Admiral Miller stood up so quickly her chair scraped back against the floor. The briefing, the charts, the logistics, all of it was gone from her mind, utterly and completely erased. There was only the name and the tattoo. "Gentlemen," she said to the stunned officers at the table, "this briefing is over." She didn't wait for a response. She grabbed her cover from a side table and strode towards the door. "Ensign, you're with me," she snapped as she passed him. "Get me everything you can find on a man named Tony Maxwell with a service record connected to Unit 734. Now." Back in the small, windowless office behind the mess hall kitchen, the lieutenant was delivering his final verdict. Tony sat in a cheap plastic chair, his hands resting on his knees. He was calm, a small island of tranquility in the face of the lieutenant's blustering storm. The young petty officer stood by the door, arms crossed, wearing a triumphant smirk. "So that's how it's going to be, Mr. Maxwell," the lieutenant said, leaning back in his chair with a sigh of finality. "Your employment is terminated, effective immediately. We'll have security escort you off the base. Frankly, you're a liability. We can't have employees who are insubordinate and create disturbances during meal service. Your age is a factor, of course. Perhaps you're not fit for this kind of work anymore. We might even need to recommend you for a cognitive evaluation." The threat was gratuitous, a final, unnecessary twist of the knife. It was the ultimate insult, questioning not just his competence, but his very mind. Tony said nothing. He had heard worse. He had endured